welcome to this afternoon. Before I start, can I get a sense of how many people were here this morning as well as now this afternoon? If you're here this morning, could you put your hand up so I can see? I'm glad you were all here this morning, yes. Thank you. I can judge what to cover. My name's Ian Bamford. I'm from the Centre for Industrial Sustainability at Cambridge. I'm not an academic. My job there is to take the research outputs from the smart academics and to try and convert them into tools and other forms of value that companies can use in order to make sure that what we spend our time researching on ends up being of value within society. So I have an odd view of the world in that sense, but hopefully that odd view will be helpful in what I'm going to talk about. So I'd like to quickly give people some insight who weren't here this morning into some of the interesting things that came out. After this session, I believe that there will be an opportunity to meet with the various presenters. So if you hear something that I tell you from this morning, find the presenter and go and ask them about what you're interested in at the end of this session. So we had some questions to start off with. How much waste does each person generate each week in Seoul? Which is the biggest food waste? And what's the most precious resource on Earth? I'm not going to ask you to answer these questions. Have a think for a second, and then I'll let you know. So the answer is 30 kilograms. So that's a reasonable amount of waste each week. Kimchi apparently is the thing that gets wasted most in terms of food in Seoul. And, well, Professor Evans would like us to think that the most precious resource on Earth was poo. And he talked quite extensively about poo this morning. If you're interested in that, you can talk to him later and ask him why he has those views. But I think we identified that actually the most precious resources were probably water and bugs. There are some bugs in the picture, but no water. We then had a very interesting and informative presentation from Kirsten Henson on waste management and innovation that came from the London Olympics and has extended into her work beyond there. In particular, Kirsten brought out some important topics about buildings being one of the most wasteful things. So the waste that comes out from the buildings that we create is one of the largest forms of waste, certainly by weight and probably by mass. And in Seoul here, maybe in Korea as a whole, it's 70%, which is a very large quantity of your waste. There were some really interesting points that came out from Kirsten's experience in the both design for and I think the follow-on from the London Olympics and the way in which the buildings and infrastructure were created in order to maximize the sustainable and benefits that could come from there. Some of these are here, so design being an extremely important part of that, so making sure that buildings are efficient in the way in which their design is put together, making sure that there is sufficient planning to allow for reuse to happen. So a lot of the effort and the ability to convert value out of construction waste comes from understanding what can be done before the waste is created in order to get the maximum value from it. And then recycling. So most construction material ends up being downcycled and loses its waste. But there are ways that the waste stream can be efficiently used if you've got the ability to make sure that you can segregate out the parts well, that there's local reprocessing capabilities. There are incentives to encourage companies to provide the sort of capabilities needed. So there's just a very small slice of a very interesting presentation. So if you're interested in construction waste, if you're interested in the design process for buildings and what that might mean, then I'd encourage you to go and talk to Kirsten later this afternoon. We had another presentation on the journey made by a bag of crisps. This was from Dr. Mukesh, and he identified that actually food waste is 45% fresh and vegetable based. So a lot of the waste that comes from the food, a lot of the food waste stream is actually those types of materials. And that overall, it's estimated that we waste $2.6 trillion worth of food waste, per year, which is an incredible amount. And I think you said about the equivalent of starting and running 6 companies the size of Samsung. So yeah, if we didn't waste as much food, we could be having a far more entertaining life. One of the things that Mukesh was focusing on in food waste was about the way in which the waste gets created, not just by us as consumers failing to use all of the parts, or perhaps reasonably peeling our potatoes and not eating the potato peelings, but that a large amount of that waste was actually coming from the process. So something like 25% waste at the farm, another 15% or so during the process of getting it from the farm to a retailer, and then we as consumers probably only waste about 10%. But overall, it adds up to about a 50% waste. So for every bag of crisps that you're eating, another one has effectively been made and never arrived. So I think there are a range of things that Mukesh pointed to that were solutions to this. One of the key ones is recognize, understand where that waste exists, and this is a wider point we'll come back to. Another one was about being really clear in communicating effectively with the various parts of the waste or of the process, the value chain, in order to understand how and what could be done by combining and understanding things better between different elements. And the third really interesting point was about transparency, about understanding and being able to use new digital technologies to track and be much more clear about how and what's happening at different stages in the process. So if those things are of interest, go and find Mukesh afterwards. Steve's not here in the room, so I can say whatever I like about what he had to say, and that's probably just as well. I've known Steve for over 30 years, so we have a good understanding. So Steve really wanted to talk about how waste is created and why. So he was talking about this idea of golden poo. So I won't go into exactly why golden poo, but the idea in general being that if you couldn't get rid of the waste that we create, then it would carry on building up. If it was gold and wasn't able to be used or consumed by any other species, then we would end up with poo the size of our landfill sites. And that's effectively what we're doing with the creation of all of the waste that isn't currently being able to be reused, recycled, or otherwise addressed within the waste hierarchy. Steve's key points, I think, were that to encourage people to think about and understand how you can turn those opportunities, that waste, which actually is a lot of value that hasn't been realized yet. How can you find a way of turning that value into something that will become a successful and profitable business? And two of the key points he were making were one, the need to be able to communicate effectively. So how do you understand where and how that waste exists, and who might be interested in it, and who might help you to be able to turn it into something of greater value? And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And the second one was about not accepting waste, that what you can do as a recipient, as the person at the end of the supply chain, buying and taking products, is don't accept products that have a lot of waste attached to them. So don't accept the packaging that you don't need. Don't accept things that you know have been created in wasteful ways. And use your power to complain, use your power to communicate, but also use your power and innovation to work out where and how you can create new, innovative solutions. And when you do, make sure you let other people know about them. So that was the broad essence of Steve's presentation, and you'll hear from him again at the end of this afternoon. So you can judge after that when and how you might address some of those things with him later today, if that's what you want to do. I made my little thing out of pieces of... so those of you who weren't here this morning may not have... Did you tell them the story about what to do? Oh, you did. Okay, good. So I've been upcycling things since 1984 when I was a sculptor and making mechanical sculptures from recycled materials, waste materials of many sorts. And I'm always still interested in mechanical things and how and what you can do. So I thought it might be possible to make a small musical instrument using some of this and a small whistle. So I'll just demonstrate whether or not it works. No. I think the answer is not quite. But there's a very important lesson here, and that is that you only find out what you can do with things when you experiment with them. And the critical thing, and we'll hear this from some of the case studies I'll talk to you about in a minute, is that it's by getting your hands on things and experimenting and playing with them, seeing what they can and can't do, that you're able to really start to make breakthroughs, start to get excited about the way in which things really work or could be. So two questions I'm going to answer this afternoon are, one, what links sugar, tomatoes and cannabis? And the other one is what I share with Cameron Diaz, other obviously than good looks. So you're laughing. I think you're agreeing with me. So the first case study I'd like to talk you through a little bit is about valorization and about a company called Elvis and Cressy. I know Cressy Wessling very well, and in 2005 she was getting very obsessed about waste and how much waste there was. So a bit like Steve's landfill picture, she was going to landfill sites, looking to try and identify where she could find some waste that she could do something with. And she wanted to find a really good target, and the red thing that's sort of circled there is that target. So what she spotted was some fire hose, and she traced back from finding that fire hose in a waste landfill site back to where it came from, the London Fire Brigade. And in talking to them, realised that they were creating hundreds of tons of waste, fire hose, every few years. I can't remember exactly how much it was per year. And that there was no solution. Because fire hose is made to be very durable and have a long life, when it does finally start to wear out, it still has many tens, if not hundreds of years of life available to it. And so ending up in landfill was a very poor outcome. So Cressy got quite excited by this and decided it was going to be something she would solve. So she took a ton or so of fire hose back to her studio and started to experiment on how to clean it, what you could do to cut it, how you could join it together, and what sort of things you might be able to invent or develop. And her first solutions were tiles. She thought, actually, this is definitely good at protecting things from the rain, and it was, but it wasn't very good when it got cold and froze and started to peel up and bend. So the first solution definitely didn't work. But she then identified that there might be another solution, in that it had a lot of properties like leather. And so she started to think about how and what you could do that you do with leather with fire hose instead. And from there, she and her partner built a range of high-end accessories, belts, handbags, and other sorts of things of that type, and decided very specifically to position them into the luxury end of the market. So she identified that high-end leather already fitted into that space, and that if she wanted to upcycle and make a profitable business, the sensible thing to do would be to try and position what she had as being very unique and very elegant into that sort of space. And she was very lucky because American Vogue ran a photo shoot with Cameron Diaz, and she happened to wear one of Elvis and Cressy's belts. And that's what I share in common with Cameron Diaz. So I also have a belt made of fire hose. And if you're interested to see the properties and understand how it works, then I'll leave it somewhere where you can look at it later. My trousers don't fall down, don't worry. So this was really good, and they were able to create a very profitable and successful business by putting together these different elements. But that wasn't really enough. In fact, I've missed a small piece of the story. In order to get the brand value really right from a luxury point of view, they built into the story of the brand, the story of fire hose as being a heroic material, something involved in life-saving, something that was really important. And they built on that connection with firefighters and so on. They also made sure that they used employees to make this material and took them on as apprentices, gave them new skills, and started to build more capability for an industry that was in decline in the UK. So they added other parts to this in order to get an effective brand. But Cressy wasn't happy enough with this, because fire hose is fine, but it's only, I think, a few hundred tons of material and not really going to make a huge difference to mankind. So they looked for something else, and they found that leather is also a very difficult material for upcycling, and they worked on the leather offcuts that come from manufacturing and designed a way of joining small pieces of leather back together again in order to make large pieces. And from those large pieces, they were able to start to build new forms, new products in the same sort of range, so bags, luxury leather rugs and other things. So they built a new business, an additional part to their business if you like, by taking on a different waste stream that was aligned to what they were already doing in their business. So they were being effective in using all the capabilities and strengths their business already had, and then adding in a suitable waste stream that would have a bigger impact than the one that they had already. I think it's a really interesting case study and way of thinking about either starting a business, or if you've got a business already, thinking about what you might add into that to add new value that maybe is about upcycling and adding and building on the capabilities you already have. So I think the learnings here are, if you're going to do something, find something that you really care about. Build value propositions that work for the upcycling part, that are high end, that are more up and not so much cross-cycling. create a brand, make sure you get your positioning for this right, and look out for markets and partnerships. And then think about how you can combine the things you've got along with upcycled or waste materials in order to create something that works much more effectively and much faster. So the second case study is completely different. This is a big company that makes sugar, refined sugar, takes sugar beet I can't do both sides, but takes sugar beet from here, works it through a standard process and creates sugar. So I'll quickly do that over here. Takes sugar beet, works it through a standard process and ends up creating sugar. But during that process there is a lot of waste that's created of many different types. And what this sugar company did was they said, actually this isn't good enough. We could be making more profit. That was their primary thinking. We could be making more profit if we didn't have to dispose of the waste. So what can we do to change that? And so what they did was they built a whole range, and you can see them along the bottom, of co-products. So they were selling back the soil they washed off the beets. They were selling back the waste. They were using the waste elements after they cleaned the beets. And they built this wide range. Now, what they, I think, very interestingly did was they worked out that they had surplus carbon dioxide, they had surplus heat, and they had low-cost energy, electricity, because of the way they'd structured and built their business. And they looked for something to do to upcycle those things, those invisible things. This isn't upcycling a product, this is upcycling waste streams that you wouldn't normally think of and see, but they exist nonetheless. And they upcycled them by building them into tomatoes. So they worked out that tomatoes, when they originally started, grew naturally in, I think, 2 million years ago they started on the earth, and they grew in an environment that was much hotter than today, much more like we'll be living with if climate change continues, with a lot more carbon dioxide. So they identified that if they built greenhouses and pumped in the carbon dioxide that they had and heated them and used the lighting to be able to change the dynamics of the seasons, they could grow very high quality, very sweet tomatoes at a lower cost than their competitors, and they could do it without having to worry about the seasonality that normally comes from different light levels. So they were able to create a really high value product set that was completely different to what they normally did, but based on how they were going to use waste streams in the business. Now, that allowed them to become the second biggest tomato producer in the UK in a matter of 3 or 4 years. They went from not making tomatoes to being so important that all of the major retailers and grocers used their tomatoes. Fantastic story, really, really helpful. However, the thing I find interesting is that they didn't stop there. They said, this is fantastic. But couldn't we get something more valuable from those waste streams than we already have? So they looked at what else they had, and they identified that the stuff they did here, creating what are called nutraceuticals, so creating things that are based on, this piece here, that are based on looking at the chemicals that exist within those waste streams that they currently convert into fish food and other medicines for animals. They said, actually, we understand this market. We understand where that sort of value comes from. So they added that in, and they said, rather than tomatoes, we could make a pharmaceutical crop. And so they started to to grow cannabis for medical use. And they're now the biggest provider or manufacturer of medicinal cannabis in Europe. So they were doing quite well, number 2, producing tomatoes in the UK. They managed to rethink what they were doing. think about their other experience and become number one in Europe for a different product with a higher value and where they're able to now have complete market dominance. Really interesting way of not resting, thinking that, okay, I've understood some things, what else can I add into my mix? So, what do we learn from that? Well, waste can be invisible. You can't always see it, but you can still upcycle it if you think about it and understand what it means. If you add in the other elements of your business, the other things that are useful, like low cost energy, which they had warm water supply and so on, then you can find other ways of building upon the simple things you've got. Always look for better outcomes. Just because you've found that fantastic way of making this, which has got value, are there other things that will be more valuable? Are there bigger markets that you can move into? Think about those things. This is how to get the real business benefit out of upcycling. And think about how what you know and as well as what you have can be useful. So I'm going to focus a little bit now on how to do some of those things. So we've been looking at value